The reflection in the black-tempered glass of my microwave showed everything. My husband's shaking hands, the crushed opioids dissolving into my morning latte, and the smirk he could not hide. He thought he was finally free to run off with my sister and my fortune. He did not realize that by the time he handed me that mug, I had already drafted the script for their destruction. Unlike his plan, mine did not leave any fingerprints. My name is Elena Vance, and at 36 years old, I am the CEO of Apex Strategy, Chicago's premier crisis management firm. My job is to clean up messes that powerful people make, to spin disasters into victories, and to remain the calmest person in the room when everyone else is losing their minds. I stood in the sleek, marble-lined kitchen of our penthouse, my back turned to the island, pretending to adjust the cuffs of my silk blouse, but I was not looking at my sleeves. My eyes were fixed on the black, tempered glass of the built-in microwave, which acted as a perfect mirror reflecting the room behind me. Through that dark reflection, I watched my husband, Blake. He moved with a jagged, nervous energy that he thought he was concealing perfectly. He reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a small, folded paper packet. My heart did not race. My hands did not tremble. I simply watched, cataloging the details with the detached precision of a crime scene investigator. He tipped the contents of the packet into my favorite ceramic mug, the one with the hand-painted gold rim. It was a white powder. I knew exactly what it was. It was fentanyl, a high-grade opioid he had hoarded from his knee surgery 6 months ago, a surgery I had paid for, just like I paid for everything else in our life. That amount was not for pain management. That amount was enough to stop a heart within minutes. He stirred the coffee vigorously, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic, a sound that echoed like a bell in the silent kitchen. He wiped a few stray grains of powder from the granite countertop with his thumb, then wiped his thumb on his robe. It was sloppy work. If I were managing this crisis for a client, I would have told them they were leaving too much evidence. But this was not a client. This was my husband trying to kill me. I took a slow, measured breath, inhaling through my nose and exhaling silently through my mouth. I forced my facial muscles to relax, sliding on the mask of the capable, unshakable CEO. I turned around just as Blake walked toward me, the mug held out in his hands like an offering. He was smiling. It was that boyish, charming smile that had fooled me 3 years ago. He asked me if I was ready for the board meeting, his voice laced with a sickening layer of faux concern. I reached out and took the mug. The ceramic was warm against my cold palms. I looked him in the eye, searching for a flicker of guilt, but I saw only anticipation. He was waiting for me to take that first sip. I brought the mug toward my lips, but before it reached them, I let my fingers go limp. The mug slipped. It crashed into the stainless steel sink behind me, shattering instantly. The latte splashed everywhere, washing down the drain in a swirl of brown foam. I gasped, feigning shock. "Oh no, I am so clumsy today," I said, watching him closely. For a split second, the mask slipped. His eyes widened in pure panic, and his jaw tightened in visible disappointment. It was not concern for the broken mug. It was the realization that his weapon was gone. He quickly composed himself, forcing a laugh that sounded too brittle, telling me it was okay and that he could make another one. I told him not to bother, claiming I was running late. I grabbed my phone and retreated to the bathroom, locking the door with a decisive click. I turned on the faucet, letting the water rush loudly to mask any sound, and unlocked my screen. I opened the Ghost app I had installed last week to mirror his phone. A new message had just arrived. It was from a contact saved as J. The text read, "Is it done yet? I booked the flight tickets for tonight. I cannot wait any longer." J was Jessica, my little sister, the same sister whose rent I paid, whose debts I cleared, and who was currently living in my old apartment. The betrayal did not sting like a slap. It settled in my gut like a stone. They were not just having an affair. They were coordinating an exit strategy, and my death was the key to the door. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back was not a victim. She was a strategist who had just been handed the most important case of her career. They wanted my money, and they wanted my life. I wiped a non-existent speck of dust from my blazer. If they wanted a tragedy, I would write them a tragedy. But in my version of the story, they would not be the ones walking away with the prize. The drive to the Apex Strategy headquarters was a blur of gray asphalt and red taillights, but my mind was miles away, replaying the events of 48 hours ago in high definition. It was the moment that should have saved my marriage. But in retrospect, it was the moment that signed my death warrant. I had wired exactly $1 million to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands to cover Blake's gambling debts. He had leveraged himself into a hole trading cryptocurrency, borrowing from people who did not send overdue notices but sent men with baseball bats. I remembered sitting him down in our living room, the transfer confirmation glowing on my tablet screen. I expected relief. I expected gratitude, perhaps even a vow to change. Instead, Blake had looked at me with a sneer that curdled the air between us. He told me that I humiliated him. He said that if I did not control the finances so tightly, he would have had the liquidity to recover his losses on his own. He called my rescue financial abuse. He took $1 million of my hard-earned money and threw it back in my face as an insult. That was the man I had just seen trying to poison my morning latte. Then there was Jessica. My younger sister was the other half of this parasitic equation. She was currently living rent-free in my starter condo downtown, a property I had kept as an investment but allowed her to occupy because she was always between jobs. Jessica had perfected the art of professional victimhood. To the family, she was the spirited artist crushed by a capitalist system. To me, she was a bottomless pit of need. I had paid for her art school, her rehab, and her credit card defaults. Now, it seemed she had decided that asking for handouts was too tedious and stealing the whole fortune was more efficient. I walked into my office suite, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the polished concrete floors. I bypassed the morning greetings and went straight to my desk, buzzing Marcus on the intercom. Marcus was technically my executive assistant, but in reality, he was a brilliant hacker who ran our cybersecurity division. I told him to come in and to bring his tablet. When Marcus arrived, I gave him a single, concise order. I wanted a full extraction of all cloud data associated with Blake and Jessica. I wanted emails, search histories, deleted messages, and location data. Marcus did not ask questions. He simply nodded, his fingers already flying across his screen. Within 30 minutes, the picture became terrifyingly clear. It was not just a sordid affair. It was a corporate takeover disguised as a tragedy. We found a shared folder titled Exit Strategy. Inside, there were drafts of press releases announcing my sudden passing due to a stress-induced stroke. They had built a narrative that fit perfectly with my public image as a workaholic CEO. They planned to sell Apex Strategy to a competitor for $50 million immediately after my funeral. Even more chilling was their search history regarding inheritance law in Illinois. They had correctly identified a fatal flaw in my personal administration. I spent my days protecting the legal interests of billion-dollar corporations, yet I had neglected to update my own will after marrying Blake. Under current state law, without a specific will excluding him, my husband was my primary beneficiary. If I died, he got everything. Jessica would then move in, and they would live off the empire I built. I felt a cold rage settle in my chest, displacing the fear. I picked up the secure line and dialed my personal attorney. I did not ask him to call the police. I knew how the law worked better than anyone. A spilled cup of coffee and some suspicious search history were circumstantial. A defense lawyer would argue Blake was just researching a thriller novel or that the powder was a sweetener. I needed something concrete. I needed indisputable proof of attempted murder. I ended the call and looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. I opened a fresh file on my secure server and typed 2 words at the top: Project Mirror. If they wanted to ruin me, I would reflect their own destruction back onto them. magnified 1,000 times. Marcus worked with the efficiency of a ghost. While Blake was at his country club pretending to network with potential investors, Marcus and his team swept through our penthouse and Jessica's apartment. They installed high-definition cameras no larger than the head of a pin inside the smoke detectors, behind the eyes of the oil paintings, and even within the decorative molding of the ceiling. By the time Blake returned home, sweating and complaining about the humidity, every square inch of our lives was being streamed directly to a secure server that only I could access. That evening, I sat in my home office and watched the digital feeds. The clarity was disturbing. I could see the pores on Jessica's face as she paced around her living room, and I could hear the ice clinking in Blake's glass in our kitchen. But the visual surveillance was secondary to the digital forensic report Marcus had just uploaded. Since his attempt with the fentanyl had failed this morning, Blake had not given up. Instead, he had escalated. The report showed a transaction on a dark web marketplace that had been completed only 2 hours ago. He had purchased liquid ricin. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Fentanyl was a crime of opportunity, using what he had on hand. Ricin was a weapon of mass destruction. It was biological warfare. The chat logs associated with the purchase revealed their timeline. They planned to dose me at the annual Apex Strategy Charity Gala, which was taking place in 2 days. It was the perfect venue. There would be hundreds of people, endless trays of drinks, and enough chaos to provide a seamless alibi. If I collapsed there, it would look exactly like the public medical emergency they were hoping for. I realized I needed to change the variables of their equation. If they felt pressured, they would act rashly. I needed to make them feel safe, and to do that, I had to validate their delusions. I began to play the part of the dying woman. Over dinner that night, I barely touched my food. I pressed my hand to my chest periodically, wincing as if in sudden pain. I complained of dizziness and a pounding headache, watching Blake's eyes light up with a predatory excitement he tried to mask as concern. He suggested I rest, his voice dripping with that same fake solicitude. Once I had established my physical weakness, I moved to the financial bait. I knew their motivation was greed, so I decided to dangle the biggest carrot imaginable. I spent an hour drafting a fraudulent but entirely convincing letter of intent. The document outlined a confidential agreement to sell Apex Strategy to a massive conglomerate for $50 million. I printed it on official company letterhead and left it carelessly on top of my mahogany desk, right next to my reading glasses. I went to take a shower, leaving the door slightly ajar. Through the crack, I watched Blake slip into the office. He moved straight to the desk. I saw him pick up the document, his eyes scanning the numbers. He fumbled for his phone, took 3 photos of the pages, and placed the paper back exactly where he found it. 10 minutes later, back in the safety of the bathroom, I checked the mirrored phone. Blake had sent the photos to Jessica with a caption that read, "Look at the number." Jessica's reply came through almost instantly. The greed in her response was palpable through the screen. She texted back saying, "Do not do it yet." She told him to wait until the witch signed the deal because they needed that cash out. She set the new deadline for this Friday. I stared at the message and let a cold, satisfied smile touch my lips. I had successfully bought myself time. More importantly, I had shifted the power dynamic. They thought they were hunters waiting for their prey to weaken, but they were actually puppets dancing on my strings. I now controlled the when, the where, and the how of the next few days. They wanted me alive until the signature dried on the page, and that delay gave me everything I needed to ensure they would be the ones whose lives ended in ruin. Jessica breezed into my corner office shortly after lunch, carrying a designer tote bag and a thermos that smelled faintly of anise and desperation. She was dressed in a bohemian chic outfit that probably cost more than my assistant made in a month. Purchased, of course, with the supplemental credit card I had given her for emergencies. She placed the thermos on my glass desk with a clatter that sounded too loud in the quiet room. She claimed it was a special herbal tea blend, an old family recipe she had dug up to help with my stress. She said she was worried about me because I had been looking so run down lately. I watched her carefully as she poured the dark, murky liquid into a cup. She did not take a sip herself. Instead, she pushed it toward me with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I thanked her, my voice steady, but I made no move to drink it. I reached for my own water bottle instead, unscrewing the cap slowly. Jessica wasted no time in launching into her passive-aggressive assault. She told me that I looked absolutely exhausted, emphasizing that the wrinkles around my eyes were getting deeper and that I had lost the spark I used to have. She said the company was draining the life out of me and that I was aging faster than our mother ever did. I took a sip of my water, letting her insults roll off me like rain on a window pane. I decided it was time to test the depth of her greed. I leaned back in my leather chair and let out a long, weary sigh. I told her that she was right, that I was tired of fighting the world. Then I dropped the first bait. I told her that I had been meeting with my lawyers to restructure my estate plan. I said that since I had no children, I felt it was morally wrong to hoard wealth. So I was planning to rewrite my will to leave 90% of my assets to a foundation for underprivileged youth if anything happened to me. The color drained from Jessica's face so fast it was almost comical. Her teacup halted halfway to her mouth. She stammered, asking if I was serious, her voice rising an octave. She tried to argue that family should come first, that blood was thicker than water, and that I shouldn't make rash decisions based on temporary stress. I watched her squirm for a moment before deploying the second, more specific trap. I leaned in, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I told her that there was one exception. I lied and said that I had liquidated a portion of my stock options last year and converted them into $5 million in cash. I told her this money was off the books, hidden in a private high-security vault at the bank, untraceable by the IRS or anyone else. I reached up and touched the silver pendant hanging around my neck. I told her the key to that vault was inside this locket and that I never took it off. Jessica's eyes locked onto the silver pendant with a hunger that was terrifying to behold. She stopped blinking. I could practically see the gears turning in her head, calculating how quickly she could get that necklace off my corpse. The bait was taken. She was no longer just thinking about the inheritance. She was fixated on the immediate, tangible prize around my neck. I broke her trance by inviting her and Blake to the signing ceremony on Friday. I told her that I needed my family there for moral support when I signed the company away. She agreed instantly, her eyes still darting back to my chest. She said they would not miss it for the world. After she left, forgetting her empty platitudes about my health, I buzzed Marcus in. He entered with a sterile sample kit. I poured the herbal tea she had brought into a vial and handed it to him. He ran it through the portable mass spectrometer we kept for forensic analysis. The results came back within 20 minutes. It was not just herbs. The tea was laced with a high dose of warfarin, a potent blood thinner. I sat in silence, staring at the report. If I had drunk that tea and then been subjected to whatever poison Blake planned to use, I would have suffered a massive, uncontrollable internal hemorrhage. They were not just trying to kill me. They were trying to ensure I bled out from the inside. It was a brutal, clumsy combination that showed just how desperate and dangerous they had become. But now I knew their full arsenal, and I was ready to turn their own weapons against them. My next meeting was not at a boardroom, but in the sterile quiet of a federal parking garage. I sat in my parked sedan, the engine off, waiting. At exactly 3 o'clock, the passenger door opened, and Agent Carter slid in. Carter was tall, sharp-featured, and owed me his career. 3 years ago, I had managed a crisis that had nearly ended his proving he was the victim of a complex frame-up. I had saved his job and his reputation. Now, I was calling in that favor. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I handed him a tablet. On it was the complete file for Project Mirror. I said that I had a situation and that I was handling it like I would any other corporate espionage case, except this time the spies were in my home. He watched in silence. He saw the high-definition video from the microwave reflection, clear as day. He saw Blake pouring the fentanyl. He scrolled to the dark web transaction receipt for the liquid ricin. He read the analysis report on the warfarin-laced tea. He saw the texts between Blake and Jessica, planning my demise around the charity gala. When he finished, he looked up, his face grim. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I did not want to be a victim reporting a crime. I wanted to be a partner in a sting operation. I was setting the stage for a final performance on Friday at the fake contract signing. I told him I needed his people to play the part of the investors. I needed the full force of the law to witness the final act. Carter closed the tablet and nodded once. He said he would bring the theater. With the federal government now on my payroll, I moved to the next phase of the setup. I had my legal team draft a new, ironclad, durable power of attorney. The document was a masterpiece of legal language, granting the named agent Blake Vance full and immediate control over all my assets, accounts, and medical decisions in the event of my incapacitation. I printed it on heavy bond paper and left it in my unclosed briefcase on the dining room table, where Blake could not possibly miss it. That evening, I staged the final piece of psychological manipulation. I waited until I knew Blake was in the adjacent study, the door slightly ajar. I made a call on my speakerphone, using an app that spoofed my cardiologist's office number. I played both sides of the conversation, having pre-recorded the doctor's lines. I argued with my doctor, my voice filled with faux frustration. I heard him say that my recent EKG results were alarming and that my heart was under extreme stress. He warned me that any sudden shock, any significant spike in blood pressure could trigger a fatal arrhythmia. I then argued loudly, saying I had to get through this Friday signing, and then hung up in a huff. The bait was set. I watched the camera feed from the study. Blake sat frozen for a long moment, processing the new information. Then, he picked up his phone. The mirrored text messages between him and Jessica lit up my own screen a moment later. Blake relayed the information about my weak heart. Jessica, ever the strategist, saw the flaw in their original plan. Killing me with ricin at the party was now too risky. What if the shock of the poison killed me before I could sign the $50 million deal? What if my weak heart gave out their new plan formed in a horrifying flurry of texts? They would not try to kill me on Friday. They would simply make me sick enough to be incapacitated. Blake would use a non-lethal but still devastating combination of the blood thinner and a sedative. Their goal was now to induce a coma immediately after I signed the papers. Blake had found the power of attorney. He sent Jessica a photo of it. They realized this was even better. Once I was in a coma, Blake would have full legal control. He could access the $50 million, clean out the $5 million cash vault, and then, at their leisure, they could authorize the hospital to withdraw care. They could pull the plug themselves. I read the texts, my hands steady. There was a moment of pure, visceral pain. This was not a stranger. This was my husband and my sister, cheerfully planning to watch me suffocate while they held hands and counted my money. The pain came, but it did not stay. It passed through me and crystallized into something harder, colder, and sharper than any knife. My resolve was no longer about justice. It was about eradication. Thursday night felt less like a domestic evening and more like a pre-execution ritual. Blake was putting on a performance worthy of an award, insisting on cooking dinner for us. This was a man who usually could not be bothered to microwave a frozen meal. Yet here he was, stirring mushroom risotto at the kitchen island with a glass of red wine in his hand. The air in the penthouse was thick with the scent of truffle oil and the heavier, unseen weight of betrayal. I sat at the counter, watching him. He was humming a soft tune, the sound of a man who believed he had already won the lottery. I knew exactly what was on the menu, and I do not mean the arborio rice. My mirrored phone had captured his search history earlier that day. He had spent 20 minutes looking up fast-acting, tasteless sedatives that could be dissolved in heavy cream sauces. He needed me to be in a deep chemical sleep that night. He could not risk me waking up while he tampered with my purse. He plated the risotto with a flourish, sliding the porcelain bowl in front of me with a smile that was all teeth. He told me to eat up because I needed my strength for the big day tomorrow. The moment he turned his back to retrieve a bottle of Pinot Noir from the wine fridge, I moved. I did not hesitate. I switched our bowls with a silent, fluid motion that took less than a second. It was the oldest trick in the book, something out of a cheap spy novel, but Blake's arrogance made him blind. He sat down and began to eat the poisoned portion he had intended for me, while I enjoyed the clean meal. Halfway through dinner, I began to stage the effects. I let my eyelids droop. I slurred a word here and there. I complained that the stress of the upcoming sale was finally crashing down on me. Blake watched me with a predatory intensity, his eyes tracking every sign of weakness. He encouraged me to finish my wine, to just let go and relax. When I finally stood up, I stumbled on purpose, gripping the edge of the counter. He was at my side instantly, playing the doting husband, guiding me toward the master bedroom. I collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed, and let my breathing slow into a heavy, rhythmic cadence. I lay there in the semi-darkness, my body limp but my mind racing at 100 miles per hour. Through the slit of my eyelashes, I watched the room. The only light came from the city glow filtering through the sheer curtains. Blake moved around the room. He did not move with the stealth of a thief. He moved with the entitlement of an owner. He walked straight to the vanity where I had left my designer handbag. I saw his silhouette clearly against the window. He pulled out my daily medication organizer. I heard the soft click of the plastic lid opening the compartment marked for Friday morning. He tipped out my actual heart medication, the harmless beta blockers I took to manage mild hypertension. He replaced them with pills from a small plastic bag he had hidden in his pocket. These were the pills that, when combined with the stress and the blood thinners Jessica had tried to slip me, would likely stop my heart right on the floor of the signing ceremony. He snapped the organizer shut and returned it to my bag. Then, he walked over to the bed. He loomed over me, his shadow stretching across my face. He leaned down, and for a moment, I thought he might feel a pang of guilt. Instead, he kissed my forehead. His lips felt like ice. "Sleep tight, my ATM," he whispered into the dark. I lay there, forcing my heart not to hammer against my ribs, willing myself to remain still. Above us, concealed within the smoke detector, the tiny camera lens blinked invisibly, recording every frame of his treachery in high definition. He had just provided the final nail for his own coffin. Friday morning broke with a leaden gray sky. I woke up before him. I went to the bathroom and took my medication, but not from the organizer he had poisoned. I took them from a secret backup bottle I had taped behind the toilet tank. When I walked out into the bedroom, Blake was awake, watching me. I began the second act of my performance. I let my hand tremble visibly as I reached for my phone. I took short, shallow breaths, pressing a hand to my sternum as if trying to calm a racing heart. Blake asked if I was okay, the excitement vibrating in his voice beneath the fake concern. I told him I felt fluttery, that it was probably just nerves. He turned away to check his phone, and my ghost app vibrated in my pocket. A text from Blake to Jessica appeared. "She is shaking. She looks pale." Jessica's reply came seconds later. "Good. It is kicking in. Do not let her back out." I looked at him and smiled weakly. I told him not to worry, that we should go make some money. I was ready to end this. The venue I had chosen for the final act of this tragedy was the Presidential Suite's private banquet hall at the Peninsula, Chicago. It was a room designed for titans of industry, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the magnificent Mile, heavy velvet drapes, and a crystal chandelier that cost more than most people's homes. The air smelled of fresh lilies and expensive cologne. To the untrained eye, the 20 people mingling with flutes of champagne were high-powered venture capitalists and corporate attorneys representing the conglomerate buying my company. In reality, half of them were senior partners from my own legal team, and the other half were federal agents under the command of Agent Carter, who was currently posing as the lead acquirer in a bespoke Italian suit. I made my entrance precisely at 10 in the morning. I had spent an hour in front of the mirror that morning, not to beautify myself, but to dismantle my appearance. I had used makeup to create subtle shadows under my eyes and paled my complexion just enough to suggest a woman on the brink of a cardiovascular collapse. I wore a sharp white power suit, but I let my shoulders slump, carrying my body as if it were a burden I could no longer bear. I leaned heavily on Blake's arm, gripping his bicep with a desperation that was only half feigned. I needed his support to walk, or so it seemed. He stood tall, radiating the confidence of a man who believes he is minutes away from inheriting an empire. He patted my hand with a sickening rhythm, whispering words of encouragement that were nothing more than instructions to keep moving toward the slaughter. Jessica was already there, playing her role to perfection. She hovered at my other side, dressed in a somber, muted dress that clashed with her usual flashy style. In her hand, she clutched a crystal glass of water like it was a holy relic. I knew exactly what was in it. It was not just water. She had spiked it with a concentrated dose of caffeine and ephedrine. If I drank it, combined with the fake heart condition I was simulating and the stress of the event, it was intended to send my heart rate into the stratosphere, triggering the very attack I claimed to fear. She offered it to me every few steps, her voice laced with a cloying sweetness, asking if I needed a sip, telling me I looked parched. I declined each time with a weak shake of my head, watching the frustration flicker in her eyes before she smoothed it over with a smile. I reached the podium at the front of the room. The room went silent. I looked out at the sea of faces, my allies disguised as my executioners. I began my speech. I did not speak with my usual authoritative cadence. Instead, I let my voice waver. I paused frequently, taking long, audible breaths, pressing a hand to my chest as if my heart were struggling to beat. I spoke about the legacy of Apex strategy, about the importance of knowing when to step back, and about trusting the future to those who care for you. I saw Blake exchange a glance with Jessica. It was a look of pure triumph. They thought I was eulogizing myself. After 5 minutes of this torture, I swayed visibly. A gasp went through the room, part of the script for my team, but genuine for the few support staff I had brought along. Blake was there instantly, his arm around my waist, guiding me toward the large mahogany table where the documents lay waiting. He sat me down, pulling the chair out with excessive chivalry. The contract sat in the center, a thick stack of papers that promised freedom for me and fortune for them. Blake leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. He tapped the signature line with his index finger. He told me to just sign it so I could go home and rest. He said he would handle everything else, implying that I never had to worry about a single thing again. I picked up the heavy fountain pen. My hand trembled, the nib hovering over the paper. I looked up, locking eyes with him one last time. I needed to hear it. I needed the final piece of moral evidence before I dropped the guillotine. I asked him, my voice barely a whisper, if he promised to take care of me. He did not blink. He did not look away. He looked straight into the eyes of the woman he had poisoned and smiled that handsome, lying smile. He said, "Forever, my love." The tip of the fountain pen touched the crisp white paper. I let it rest there for a heartbeat, creating a small pool of black ink. It was the signature they had been killing me for, the ink that would turn into blood money the moment it dried. Jessica could not contain herself any longer. The anticipation was vibrating off her in waves. She shoved the crystal glass into my peripheral vision, her knuckles white around the stem. She urged me to drink some water, her voice tight and breathless, telling me it would help me calm down. She was practically forcing the poison down my throat. I released the pen. It clattered onto the mahogany table, rolling toward the edge. I took the glass from her hand. Blake watched me, his eyes wide, waiting for the swallow that would stop my heart. I looked at the liquid, clear and deadly, and then I looked at him. With a sudden, violent motion, I dashed the contents of the glass straight into his face. The water splashed across his eyes, his nose, and his expensive silk tie, dripping down onto his pristine suit. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Blake sputtered, wiping his eyes, shock rendering him mute. In that silence, I stood up. I did not struggle to rise. I did not lean on the table. I stood to my full height, squaring my shoulders. The tremor in my hands vanished. The pallor in my cheeks seemed to evaporate as the adrenaline of the kill flooded my system. I looked down at them, no longer the dying wife, but the CEO who had built an empire from nothing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small remote control. I did not say a word. I simply pointed it at the massive screen behind me and pressed the center button. The slide displaying the Apex Strategy logo disappeared. In its place, a video file began to play in high definition. It was the footage from the kitchen 3 days ago. The angle was artistic, captured from the reflection of the black microwave glass. Every person in the room watched as Blake pulled the packet of fentanyl from his pocket. They watched him pour it into my coffee. They saw the smirk. Then, the video cut to the night vision footage from the bedroom only hours ago. The audio was crisp and clear. The room heard the click of the pill organizer. They watched Blake swap my heart medication for the lethal cocktail he had prepared. The gasp from the audience was visceral. It started low and swept through the room like a wave. My real employees, the ones who had been invited as witnesses, covered their mouths in horror. I looked at Blake and Jessica. The blood had drained from their faces so completely that they looked like wax figures. Blake stood frozen, water dripping from his chin, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He was watching his own crime broadcast to the federal agents he thought were investors. But Jessica broke first. The realization that her golden ticket had just been incinerated was too much for her fragile psyche. She let out a shriek that tore through the sophisticated atmosphere of the hotel suite. She screamed that it was fake, that I had staged it all with special effects. Driven by a feral panic, she lunged across the table, her claws reaching for the stack of documents, desperate to destroy the evidence of their conspiracy. Jessica's manicured hand was inches from the paper when I slammed my palm down on top of hers, pinning her wrist to the table. The impact rattled the silverware. She looked up at me, her eyes wild and wet with panic, struggling to pull her arm back. My grip was iron. I told her in a voice cold enough to freeze the water she had just tried to force-feed me to not touch them. I leaned in closer, letting her see the absolute clarity in my eyes, devoid of any illness or frailty. I told her that those were not contracts for the sale of the company. I told her that they were emergency federal arrest warrants. As if on cue, the room erupted into coordinated motion. Agent Carter stood up from the head of the table, shedding his persona of the wealthy investor like a cheap coat. He reached into his bespoke jacket and pulled out his badge, the gold shield catching the light of the crystal chandelier. Around the room, the other guests did the same. The sound of heavy chairs scraping against the parquet floor was followed by the sharp, metallic rasp of handcuffs being unclipped from belts. Carter announced clearly that this was the FBI and that everyone needed to remain where they were. Blake collapsed back into his chair, looking small and pathetic, the water I had thrown still dripping from his nose. He started to stammer, his eyes darting around the room looking for an exit that did not exist. I turned my attention to him. I needed him to understand the full extent of his failure before they took him away. I told him that I knew about the gambling debt. I told him that I had paid off the $1 million he owed to the crypto loan sharks 48 hours ago. He looked at me, confusion warring with fear. He asked me why I would do that if I knew he was trying to kill me. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I told him that I did not do it because I loved him. I did it to remove his only defense. I explained that if he had gone to trial owing money to violent criminals, his defense attorney would have argued that he was acting under duress, that he was forced to kill me to save his own life from the mob. By paying the debt, I had stripped him of that excuse. I told him that now, when the jury looked at him, they would not see a desperate man in a difficult situation. They would see a monster driven by pure, unadulterated greed. I then turned to Jessica, who was trembling under the firm grip of a female agent. I told her that I had known she was sleeping with my husband for 6 months. I told her that I could have perhaps forgiven the betrayal of the affair eventually, or at least ignored it. But I could not forgive the stupidity. I looked her up and down with pity. I told her that trying to kill me to steal my money was not ambition. It was sheer idiocy. The alliance between them shattered instantly. Blake pointed a shaking finger at Jessica. He screamed that it was all her idea, that she had pressured him into it, that she was the one who wanted the money because she was broke. He tried to paint himself as the victim of her manipulation. Jessica's face twisted into a mask of hatred. She screamed back, calling him a coward and a spineless failure, spitting curses at him until the agents physically restrained her. Agent Carter moved in to finalize the scene. He confiscated the glass of water Jessica had held, sealing it in an evidence bag with a gloved hand. Another agent patted Blake down and removed the plastic bag of lethal pills from his pocket, the tangible proof that would ensure they never saw freedom again. I stood still and watched them being handcuffed, their wrists bound behind their backs with the same cold efficiency I used to run my boardroom. As they were dragged out of the suite, kicking and shouting accusations at each other, I did not feel joy. I did not feel the rush of victory. I felt the distinct clinical relief of a surgeon who had just successfully cut a malignant tumor out of a body. I was sore, and there would be scars, but the rot was finally gone. 3 months after the sting operation at the Peninsula Hotel, the gavel finally came down in the Cook County Courthouse. The trial had been the media sensation of the season, but for me, it was just the closing arguments of a long, tedious business deal. Blake and Jessica stood before the judge clad in matching orange jumpsuits, stripped of their designer clothes and their arrogance. The jury did not need long to deliberate. The video evidence I had provided was irrefutable. They were both convicted of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, along with a laundry list of wire fraud and attempted grand larceny charges. They were looking at life sentences without the possibility of parole. I stood on the witness stand not as a weeping, betrayed wife, but as the CEO of Apex Strategy. I walked the court through the timeline of Project Mirror with the same clinical precision I used during quarterly earnings calls. I explained how I identified the threat, isolated the variables, and neutralized the risk. The public reaction was unexpected. Instead of pitying the woman whose husband and sister tried to kill her, the world seemed to fear and admire me in equal measure. My company's stock price had risen 15% since the arrest, driven by investor confidence in a leader who clearly could not be outmaneuvered. After the verdict was read, I returned to my office to handle the final administrative details of my marriage. My lawyer was waiting with a stack of documents. I signed the divorce papers with a flourish, feeling the weight of the last 3 years lift off my shoulders. But I was not done yet. I also signed a civil lawsuit against Blake's remaining assets. I was going to claw back every cent of the $1 million I had paid to his loan sharks. I would take his sports car, his watch collection, and his half of the equity in our penthouse. He would enter prison penniless, just as he deserved. Later that afternoon, I found myself in a small, quiet coffee shop near the river, a place where nobody knew my name. I ordered a latte. When the barista placed the steaming mug on the black glass table in front of me, I paused. I looked down at the dark, reflective surface. 3 months ago, a reflection in a microwave had shown me a victim about to be murdered. Today, the reflection in the table showed a survivor. The woman staring back at me was sharper, colder perhaps, but she was alive and she was victorious. I pulled my phone from my purse. It had been buzzing incessantly with calls from my parents. They had spent the last few weeks leaving voicemails, begging me to ask the judge for leniency, asking how I could let my own sister rot in prison. They claimed she was just confused, that she had been led astray. They wanted me to be the bigger person. I looked at their names on the screen one last time. I did not feel anger. I just felt done. I tapped the block contact button, severing the last tie to the toxicity that had surrounded me for so long. I picked up the mug and took a long, slow sip. The coffee was hot, rich, and completely free of poison. I smiled, a genuine, private smile that reached my eyes. The taste of freedom is better than I imagined. I stood up, adjusted my coat, and walked out of the cafe, merging into the bustling crowd of Chicago, ready to write a new story that belonged only to me. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment down below and share your thoughts on how I handled my revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more people.